drive, then we'll join them in. But just to introduce myself, I'm Russell Smith. I'm a director of the Scottish Crofting Federation and a crofter in Bonar Bridge in South East Sutherland, running a flock of North Country Cheviots, and we are members of QMS and have been for many years. Okay, so what we'll cover tonight is the main part of the meeting is Eilidh Corr of QMS, who will take us through the health plans and how the meetings have gone. They've been holding a series of meetings over the last year and what's come out of that. There will be time for questions and discussion and things after that on the QMS health plans. And then depending on how time goes, Miranda can take us through some of the things that the Scottish Crofting Federation are doing, mainly around the agricultural bill consultation, which is obviously key for all of us and for the future of crofting. So Miranda, at the top of your screen there, is the SCF policy officer and is doing a great job. So you're probably all familiar with the Zoom etiquette and you're all muted just now, which is great. If you're having problems with your internet link, turning off video often helps. But otherwise, you can go questions, raise your hand using the toolbar at the bottom. Under reactions, raise hand, and then with the numbers we've got, you'll be able to spot that. The chat room is open and some of you have put your comments in that. So if you've got questions, you can put them in there, or you can raise your hand ready to ask them. This talk is being recorded, and I hope that's okay with everybody. I see that Miranda's done that. So that's really all I wanted to say, just to welcome you all again, and we'll hand you over to Eilidh to take us through QMS Health Plan Meetings 2022. You should all be able to see that on your screen. If you can't, shout now. Otherwise, over to you, Eilidh.
Thank you very much, Russell, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We have held a series of meetings this year in conjunction with the good folks at SCF, really to try and give everybody a chance to come and hear the QMS perspective on health plans and ask any questions that they have, because this is there are some changes around our standards in recent times which have caused some concerns, particularly for crofting members. And so really we just wanted to give everybody opportunities to come and chat with us about it and hear a bit more about it. So as Russell said, my name is Eilidh Corr. I work for QMS as Animal Health and Welfare Manager, which is a very grand title, but essentially means I'm the QMS vet. I don't work directly within the assurance team, so my day-to-day job isn't as part of the standards operation. But clearly a lot of the standards do have relevance from a health and welfare perspective. So I end up working alongside the brands integrity team who run the standards quite a lot. And cause health planning, there's a veterinary link there. I've been quite heavily involved in these meetings this year. So I'm just going to set the scene a little bit with some background about QMS. These slides would usually be delivered by one of our brands integrity team when we did our roadshow this summer, but I'll take you through those quickly and then we'll get into the meat and bones of health plans. I'm very, very happy if people do want to chip in with questions, that you do that throughout the presentation. You're equally welcome to sit on them until the end. But I don't mind being interrupted at all, so please feel free to let us know if there's anything you'd like to ask as we go through. Okay, so just to set the scene, QMS is a non-departmental public body, so a sort of arm's length public body from the Scottish Government. We therefore can't lobby, which is something that's important to make clear, because that's something people quite often want us to do. But we are funded by farmers and processors, so there is a funding stream collected through levy and a separate ring-fenced funding stream that comes through the issuance scheme. So that's money in to run the insurance scheme, the issuance scheme, money out for that side of things. So yeah, full-time equivalent 25 members of staff. So a lot of people are quite surprised by that and perceive that we're a bigger organisation, but it's pretty small really, considering the reach, the range of tasks that QMS undertake. So the strategy of QMS, bit corporate, I guess, but the basic pillars are to develop, support, promote, and protect the red meat industry in Scotland. So those are the aims, and essentially these are the things that are considered within QMS before we undertake any piece of work. The question is always asked, does it actually fit with any of these core things? Because if it doesn't, we shouldn't be doing it. So how are the assurance schemes made up? Again, they're quite a big operation. So in total, we have nearly 10,000 members, as you can see there, and the vast majority of those are members of the cattle and sheep assurance schemes, with smaller numbers members of the pig scheme, and then obviously the rest of the supply chain is represented there in terms of producers, hauliers, marts, and feeds. So quite wide-ranging, and this really is the key to Scotch assurance, is that it is whole of life, born, reared, processed in Scotland. So that's key to the brands that we operate. So just to set the scene a bit on how the whole assurance thing works, because you will probably be aware, if you're members of QMS, that when you have an assessment each year, it isn't actually a QMS member of staff that comes and does that assessment. So the job of QMS is to operate these schemes and essentially to come up with the standards that the schemes consist of. However, the standards are not generated by one of us sitting in a cupboard thinking up things with which we can torture farmers and crofters each year. Those standards are agreed by a group of stakeholders, which, you know, anybody can come forward and offer to join the standard setting body. It's a group of industry people who understand the industry, who you know, there are many farmers on there. We have vets, we have other members of the supply chain who set the cattle and sheep standards and agree what they are. And when those go under review, that's the committee of people that agree what the standards will ultimately be. But we do also take feedback from right across the industry. So absolutely anyone can feed into those standards. Anyone with an interest, with a stake in them, can you know, feed into QMS, can get in touch with us. And that goes for all of our members as well. So if you feel something in the standard isn't right, then you can tell us that, and it will be taken into consideration by that committee of people who agree those standards. So once the standards have been agreed by that group, then those are the QMS standards. But we can't then carry out the assessments on farm, because it would essentially be like us marking our own homework. So we engage a certification body to come out and do that for us. And so they assess those standards independently on farm. Now you'll be, I hope, familiar with the fact that we're using a new certification body this year. In years gone by, that service was provided by a company called Lloyd's Register. That went out to tender, as it does every 5 years. That has to go out to tender to make sure we're getting best value. And the tender was won this year by Food Integrity Assurance, FIA. This is a new organisation, and they have been developed under the umbrella of SAOS, the Scottish Agricultural Organisation Society. I hope I've got that right. But essentially the cooperatives body for agriculture in Scotland. And they've got a very good track record. So they also operate Scotty ID, who those of you with cattle in particular will be very familiar with. So they've got a really good understanding of agricultural sector, the industry, how it works, how the supply chain works. And we hope that having that sort of local understanding will help keep their feet on the ground and keep them quite pragmatic. So we're quite optimistic about our relationship with them, and I should always say we're always open to feedback on the assessment process. Again, we do sometimes hear from people who have queries after assessments or feel something wasn't right. We'd always encourage you to let us know, because if we don't know about problems, we can't do anything about them. So. And the final element of independence that really adds rigor to the whole standards, and that's what makes the standards attractive to the ultimate consumer and retailers and things, is the UCAS accreditation. So UCAS is the organisation that basically ensures that the whole way our standard system is operated is to the highest standards, and that's something that they will also assess your red tractor and your cereals and any of your other assurance schemes. They will assess them to those standards. Just a little bit on how we get to these standards. I did say, we've got this committee that agrees them, but this is a constant cycle that goes on. So essentially, the standards are developed in consultation with anybody that wants to feed into them, and they'll then be reviewed by that committee, who will decide what the standards should look like. When that's been agreed, the standards will then go live. So the new standards went live this past April, and they'll be in place for 2 years, but they will undergo an interim review in the intervening year. So they'll be reviewed this spring, just to make sure that they are current, that we don't need to respond quickly to any changes in circumstance, to any changes in the industry that we might need to respond to. So they do go under regular review. And the other thing that happens is that they're benchmarked. So one of the things that our assurance scheme team does is they will look at equivalent schemes within the UK and across the world, and look at what those schemes are seeking from their members, and make sure that we're not falling behind. And we try to lead where we can, but at a level that's reasonable and achievable for members. So it's important that we understand what other schemes are doing. And that also comes into play when it comes to things like trade, because sometimes standards are something that other countries are very interested in. So it's helpful for us to know where they are at. Okay, so this whole process that takes place has itself been going under review in this past year, just to make sure it's relevant, and that we're not missing any opportunities to engage and get feedback on it. So finally, just a wee bit more about food integrity assurance. As I said, this is the organisation that will come onto the farm and do the assessment. So they are they, as I say, have won the tender for this 5 years, took over in April this year. I have no doubt there will perhaps be some teething problems, but I think the clear message that we've been getting across to them, and I'm confident they understand, is that consistency is really, really important. So no member wants to see a farm down the road that looks really untidy and messy, and it's being assessed as apparently at the same standard as their lovely tidy croft. That's not what we want. So we're really keen to make sure the assessors are consistent and fair, and that's really where the focus is with FIA. So that's just a little bit of background. I'm just going to, I see Russell's just made the very good point that SCF also has a rep on the standards committee. So there is that, the crofting interests are being fed into the standards committee there. But any of you with an interest could contribute. So please bear that in mind. Okay, so just to go into the background of health planning. So as I say, I'm the QMS vet. I qualified in 2004. I spent about 13-14 years in mixed practice dealing with all species in Strathspey. I then joined SAC at the vet lab in Inverness, and I worked there for about 3.5 years. And after that, I then moved to QMS. So I've had a lot of contact with crofting through my work. So where does health planning actually come into it? And what I've done here is I've just taken some excerpts from our standards just to give a bit of background to why they're even here. And this first sentence actually just encapsulates why health planning is in the standards. Health planning and record keeping are an important part of improving the health, welfare and productivity of livestock, the performance and sustainability of the farm business, and are essential for antimicrobial stewardship. So actually that kind of encapsulates everything in a nutshell. But other important points in the standards are that members must receive at least one annual veterinary visit. Now that's no big deal if you've got 150 cows and you've got the vet out, 4 times a year, but it is a bit different perhaps if you're running a smaller crofting enterprise and you wouldn't necessarily have the vet in to see your sheep, for example. So that is a point that's a little bit different and something we need to think about from the perspective of crofters in more remote areas. And the other point here is that the standards ask that a relevant written animal health plan must be in place for all livestock, which must be reviewed annually in conjunction with the vet. So the health plan itself isn't new, that's been in the standards for a long time, but the involvement of the vet to review that with you is what's new. So these are standards that were brought in April. However, we did get a lot of feedback on this, which won't be a surprise to a lot of you. And as a result of that feedback, a dispensation was put in place to allow an extra year for members that were concerned they weren't going to manage to get their health plan reviewed by their vet in time. That has been, you won't get your knuckles wrapped for not having that done at this point in time, and that will be reviewed again this coming April. But ultimately that's what's in the standards at the moment, is just that there is a dispensation for those that haven't managed to fulfill it. So why have we got all this in here? If it's something that we acknowledge that's difficult for some of our members, why on earth have we put it in the standards? And this is an absolutely horrible slide, so don't worry about the detail here. It's just to remind me what to talk about. So essentially, part of it's to do with legislation. So EU legislation, whether we like it or not, is still relevant to us here in Scotland. And depending on which government you listen to, that depends on that. The reasoning is different. But ultimately, the Scottish government's policy is to remain very closely aligned with the EU, simply because their ultimate aspiration is to rejoin the EU. But the other thing to say is that Westminster's policy is to remain very closely aligned to the EU because they are keen to trade. And obviously, if we deviate too far, then that impacts on our trade. So what does EU legislation say? Well, I've just included here Article 25 from the Animal Health Regulations, which basically explain that if you are a keeper of animals, you need to receive animal health visits from the vet. And they have written this exquisitely vaguely, but they've just said at frequencies proportionate to the risks posed by the establishment. So I mean, what does that even mean? Who knows? We believe this was written with the intention of it being tightened up at some point. And I think if that did happen, it's very unlikely that they would make the frequency of a vet visit any less than annual, given most production systems are seasonal. So we have to have that in the back of our minds. And obviously there have been issues this year with export, and members of assurance schemes have been allowed to continue to export based on the fact that the assurance schemes ask for annual vet visits. So that has been resolved at the moment, but members of assurance schemes were fortunate that their products could still be exported when the gold plating came from Westminster. So we need to align with this, but we also need to horizon scan for future changes. So we know that this was written with an intention of being tightened up, and it is usually better for our members if we can give them a nod in the direction of travel rather than having some grenade be dropped when there's a legislation change. Equivalency with other schemes is also really important. So perhaps less so for some of you, I don't know, but for people who want to sell animals into the red tractor scheme, for example, across the border, then the animals need to be part of an assurance scheme, ideally, to be able to come and go between schemes. And the other thing really is that actually, if we're not producing animals to the same standards, then we can't say that Scotch is the best, and none of us really want to be in a position where we can't defend that position. So, but ultimately, I mean, those are all kind of stick reasons rather than carrot reasons for this, and ultimately improving health benefits everyone. It benefits the business, it benefits the animal welfare side of things. There are greenhouse gas emissions benefits. There are antibiotic use benefits. There are lots and lots of benefits to doing this. So it's agreed widely that it's a good thing to do, to be proactive about guarding animal health. And in the words of Tim Geraghty from SAC in Aberdeen, animal health is a real asset. It's an asset that a business has that should be protected. So I see Jerry has added a question there before I go any further, asking about the health plan, the template, who writes it and where it's recorded. So I hope that I'll cover most of that actually as we go through, Jerry. So I will try and answer your question as we come through this. But if any queries remain at the end, please chip in, and I will fill in any gaps that I leave. So what I wanted to do is actually just get us thinking about what a health plan actually does for you, because we tend to think of it as a bit of paper or a document, but actually health planning is a process you should engage in. It should be something you do, not something that you could just look at. So I thought I'd just try and have a little think about what I consider when I am writing a health plan for a client, with a client, relative to their lives. So first of all, preventative medicine. So almost all of you, I'm sure, if you go in stock, will occasionally use a wormer, you'll use a vaccine, you'll use some sort of product to prevent illness in your animals. We all know preventative medicine makes good sense. It's far better to prevent a problem than try and deal with it when it happens. But it's also important to ask the question about what products are we using, and are we giving them at the right time, and are we giving them by the right mechanism, and do we even need to give them in the first place? And it's very easy to fall into a habitual treatment by calendar. So we always give the same product at the same time for the same reason. And we now know that actually that's not always the best policy. So the example I would give you is that for a lot of people, for years and years, they've always given a fluke treatment at whatever, last weekend in October, whenever it is that they routinely do it. And fluke has become far less predictable in recent years. And we used to know when fluke could be an issue and what time of year, but we've actually had some cases recently where some farms that were having to treat routinely, we've gone out and done some testing and discovered that actually their fluke risk was so late that their lambs were away long before there was any risk of fluke. And so any treatment that they'd given those lambs was a complete waste of time, waste of money, and probably just increased the risk of resistance developing. So it is important that we review what we're doing periodically and make sure that we're still doing the right thing, we're still doing the best thing for the livestock, and that will change over time. So the other thing is dealing with disease, which despite the very best preventative medicine, unfortunately, particularly if you've got sheep, they will find a way to get sick and die, as we all know. And it does happen, it does crop up. So it's really important that we have a bit of an understanding of what disease risks we might face. And just because, you know, Crofter Jones has got a problem with foot rot, you know, Crofter McDonald over the hill might never ever see foot rot, but might have a lot of issues with pneumonia, for example. So different holdings, different farms, different enterprises will have different disease risks. So it's useful to review that with your vet periodically to make sure that that you're reaching the correct diagnosis. If you're making a decision yourself on what's wrong, it's very easy to end up down a rabbit hole with the wrong diagnosis, and then obviously you should be able to properly address what the problem is. Make sure you're choosing the best possible treatment for that. So particularly in this day and age when we're very concerned about using antibiotics responsibly, it's very, very important that we use the correct treatment. And what was the correct treatment 20 years ago is no longer the correct treatment. You know, for example, with worm problems, I mean, when I qualified, you would dose every animal in the flock. We now know that that would be really bad practice. So we would always try and leave at least 10% of the best of them not treated when it comes to worms. So that's a complete sea change in best practice. And if we never really review what we're doing properly, then we don't keep up to date with that. And very, very importantly here, I've just put a note of when should you investigate further. So again, you know, using the example of a bit of lameness, some foot rot, you might see that quite often in your flock. Each year you might have a handful that you might need to turn over and treat, maybe give them an injection. And that might be normal for you, but it's really important to establish where's the threshold at which point you decide, no, this is actually a really significant problem. And your vet's the best person to tell you that, well, actually 10% is crazy, that's far too many, we need to tackle this, there's something wrong. Or to give you a bit of guidance to say, well, actually, I don't think we're dealing with foot rot now. I think you might now have CODD, which is a much nastier kind of foot problem and requires slightly different treatment. So it is important just to have that laid out and have that discussion before the problem arises. Okay, so other things your health plan could do, keeping disease out. So obviously we've spoken about your animal health being your biggest asset, really. You don't want to risk that by introducing disease. So it's really important you know what the risks are to your stock, and what those risks are will depend very much on your sort of buying and selling behaviour, the way your animals are managed. Are they co-grazed, or do they do they have their own land and they don't ever mix with other stock? Are there any wildlife risks? Could they bring in diseases? And are the risks that you might have been worried about 10 years ago still the same risks you need to worry about today? And ultimately, are you doing everything you can to control those? And there is nobody better to tell you about that than your vet. And what they can't do is tell you that your neighbour down the road is coaching with scab, and that they can't broach client confidentiality, but they certainly can tell you that there are certain disease risks that you should take very, very seriously, because they absolutely do have the local knowledge of what's on the go. So that is an opportunity there to try and make sure that you're doing everything you can to defend that asset that you've got of good animal health. And finally, this word stewardship on this slide. Now that may seem like quite a vague term, and you may not all be familiar with stewardship. What am I talking about here? But what I mean when I use that term is that you'll be aware of the concept of resistance, wormer resistance, fluke treatment resistance, which is when products that used to be very effective at killing these parasites no longer work. So we do know that we need to use those products responsibly to try and prevent resistance developing and protect them for our own future use. But it's not just wormers that we need to worry about there. We also know that resistance can develop to antibiotics. And there is a lot of concern from consumers around the use of antibiotics in livestock. And consumers are concerned that we could create resistance problems in livestock that could then cause problems in humans and lead to humans having medicines be ineffective in future. And we're not talking about some obscure diseases here. We're talking about potentially children with a sore throat and being overwhelmed by an infection that usually an antibiotic would have been able to treat. So I think it's important not to overstate those risks. I think the evidence suggests that antibiotic use in livestock is probably very sensible and reasonable, but it is a very major area of consumer concern and ever increasing concern. We've had contact here in QMS about this just last week from some retailers. So it is really important that we can defend what we're doing and make sure that we aren't misusing these products. And having a discussion about this and a policy about their use and a review of the use of antibiotics with your vet each year is an important way of you being able to say that you've done your bit and to justify your own position. Okay, and finally, just to cover the last couple of things that your health plan should be doing for you. Productivity. Ultimately, we usually rear livestock because there is a product at the end of it. We want to get the best out of them, not just from a business perspective, but because it's not nice to be dealing with animals that are unwell, that are unproductive. It's quite demoralising. It's always nicer to look at happy, content stock and feel that you're doing a good job. So it's a really good opportunity to sit down with your vet with a cool head, not at 2 a.m. because there's something calving and it's all a bit of a disaster and stressful, but actually nice and calm, have a chat with them, talk about how things have been going, talk about any areas where you think things might have been a bit sticky or didn't go as well as you thought, and forecast forward and look at what you can do to try and minimise risks in the future. And the other thing to say is just to find out about new things, because as I've said a couple of times already, what was the norm 20 years ago can change pretty dramatically in a short period of time. And certainly lots and lots of things available to me now as a vet that weren't there when I qualified. And lots of things that I would have routinely done when I first graduated that I wouldn't do now because it wouldn't be good practice. So it is your vet's job to keep up to date with this stuff. And it's really valuable once in a while to just go through how you're doing things, as you've done, as we've just done this health plan, and just reflect on whether what you're doing is the best thing that you could be doing for your stock and your business. Okay, so just to move on, from my perspective as a vet, it's quite tricky serving all of these different clients that want different things. We've got, huge, big finishing units in the east. We've got little crofts in the west. We've got everything in between, and ultimately, it doesn't matter what the enterprise looks like. Animals can be a source of disease risk for humans, and we're responsible for their welfare. We need them to have a good, healthy life, and anyone that keeps animals on any scale really should have access to professional advice and support to make sure that they're getting that best practice right the way through what they do. So disease is not interested in whether you're a wee croft in the west or a big finisher on the east, or whoever you are in Timbuktu. Disease can be a risk to any of these animals, and when I say disease, I mean endemic diseases such as worms and pneumonia and things that we just find in our livestock. New diseases like foot and mouth that aren't normally found in this country but make their way in, or zoonotic diseases which can spread to humans. So they're a risk everywhere. So there were some concerns about what vets thought about managing to deliver these health plans for our crofting clients, because it seems like quite a big ask over and above what they were already doing. So we went out to the Highlands and Islands Veterinary Services Scheme, which is the group of practices that serve all of your areas, and they're a great organisation of vets, all working in crofting counties, and we asked them what they thought about doing health plans, and I'll let you have a wee read through some of these quotes. But we were really pleasantly surprised by how positively they felt about having this opportunity to talk to you about your livestock's health, not in a reactive situation, but in a proactive situation. So vets were keen to sit down and have a chat with people. They thought it was a really good opportunity to try and improve things. It's sometimes a nice way to tell people they're actually doing a really good job. And sometimes it's surprising how much benefit both parties got from it. Really felt like they could make improvements and came away in a better position. So just a little note on what you're asking from your vet. So a lot of people think, well, I could just give my vet this bit of paper and they can sign it for me, and then the vet's reviewed it and that's fine. But actually, we can't ask vets to sign a document they're not happy with. So please don't scribble a health plan on a bit of paper and pop it on your vet's reception and say the assessor will be here in half an hour, can you just sign that? Because it puts your vet in a really difficult position. So they do have technical expertise to offer you, and they can help you with improvements. They can support you with difficulties you're having, and they give that third party robustness to the health plan. And going forward, who knows where we're going to be in terms of farm support, but I think it's very likely that we will be looking at carbon footprints. We're going to be looking at efficiency, and that support we know will be conditional. So the health plan may well come into that, I suspect, in terms of being able to evidence that you're doing everything you can to be efficient. But make the best of it. They're there. The purpose of this is to try and improve things for you, and improve things for your stock. So do try and make the best of this and get as much as you can out of it. So the health plan itself, what must it contain? You don't need to worry too much about this. This is all in the standards, and your vet should know what they need to include. But essentially, we've touched on most of this already. A review of your medicine use, touch on your disease risks that you have, review of necessary mutilations. That's not saying you shouldn't be castrating your lambs or tailing them. It just is you saying that you have reflected each year on whether you still need to do it, and if it's justified that you need to do it, that's absolutely fine. It's just the evidence that you have reviewed that it is still necessary, and I think that's important in terms of what our consumers want. So coming back to Jerry's question about the health plan, is there a template and who writes it, and how do the details of this work? So what will the health plan actually look like? And it is really important here to say I am not prescriptive about what this health plan looks like. Vets like to do them in all different formats. Some of them use software, some of them write them up themselves. QMS do have a template available on their website, which some people really like to use and others find is a bit restrictive. But essentially, it doesn't matter what format it's in, it's about the process of getting there. So provided those essential elements that were on the previous slide are in there, we're not going to give you a hard time about whether it's got pretty pictures. You can have a great big book if you want, but I would far rather you had something much more basic that you actually acted on than having a great big hefty tome that you never actually look at, and it just gets dusted off when the assessor comes to visit. So far better to have something practical, meaningful, that you actually refer to, that actually is consistent with what you're trying to do, than having something with a huge amount of detail that doesn't actually mean much. So that's the perspective on health plans. In terms of how it can be simplified, because we do recognise it's not so straightforward if you don't have the vet, on your holding regularly. So a few thoughts on how this might be made a little bit easier. Now, some of you might already be aware of this, but QMS does offer group membership for townships, and that's particularly suitable if you've got grazing groups and the animals are managed almost together. That might be very appropriate for you, and it does save you a wee bit of cash as well. It might even be the case that your vet feels that they could do health planning as a group. Now, that's entirely up to the vet, and they can decide what scenarios are appropriate for that. But certainly that might be a useful thing for you to do, again, particularly if the animals are largely managed as a single group for some of the year at least. The level of detail can be appropriate to the enterprise. So as I said previously, it doesn't have to be some great big massive intricate document if that's not appropriate to what you're doing. If you like numbers and graphs and you want to make it really, really detailed and plan things out to the nth degree, then that's great too. But you don't have to do that. This is meant to benefit you, and for some of you that means keeping it really streamlined, and that's fine. And a really important point to make here is, while we do require an annual vet visit, it doesn't have to be to do your health plan. So if you had the vet round last week because you had a tut with a bad foot, you don't need to get the vet to come next week to do your health plan. The vet's been on your holding, he knows what it looks like. You can do the health plan over the phone, you can do a Zoom meeting, whatever you and your vet like. So really important, the vet doesn't have to arrive on your doorstep to do the health plan. They just have to have been on the holding at some point that year. Okay, almost finished. So where are we now? What's happening next? So as I said earlier, nobody's getting wrapped over the knuckles if they haven't got their vet involved with their health plan this year. Anyone who gets an assessment during this year, from the 1st of April this year to April next year, anyone that gets an assessment and hasn't got their vet involved in their health plan, you won't get your knuckles wrapped. The assessor will make a note of it simply so that we can look back and find out if there's particular areas where people are really struggling to access veterinary support, or if there's particular themes amongst the people that are struggling with it. So that's really why we're gathering that information. And we are at the moment in the middle of a really interesting piece of work looking at how this is currently delivered in the more remote areas. So this woman here is Kim Hamer. So she's a very, very experienced vet, very highly qualified vet, based at the University of Glasgow Vet School, which is the best vet school, just in case anybody was wondering. And she has a lot of experience in sheep practice, often in very, very rural parts of Wales. She spent a lot of time working there, and again working with sheep keepers who perhaps didn't have regular communications and contact with their vets, and trying to engage them and see if she could bring some value to her interactions with them. Now she's really interested in this sort of work, and through again the Highlands and Islands Veterinary Services Scheme Group, we have rolled out a study this year that's involved asking all of the practices in this area to give us their thoughts on how they manage at the moment with health planning, how they manage with interactions with sheep keepers. There are some difficulties. If you're a vet, people will maybe phone up and ask for an antibiotic, and actually prescribing an antibiotic to an animal you haven't seen for a farm or a croft that you haven't been to as a vet puts you on very, very difficult ground in terms of what you're allowed to do. So it is a difficult area for vets. And this piece of work has gathered feedback. We've had over 50 completed responses, and these are meaty questionnaires with lots of detail, currently undergoing analysis, and we're looking forward to the results of that being presented next year. So you will hear more about this, and we hope that this will form a basis for a bid for much more funding to support us developing something which is really useful to the vets that are delivering veterinary services to you in your areas. So watch this space for more on that one. So that's all I have for you now. Very, very happy to take any more questions, and I hope, Jerry, that kind of answered your questions that you put in the chat, but please feel free to come back to me if you would like any more on that one.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Eilidh. There's a lot of detail in that. So anyone who does have questions, either shout out or raise your hand. Just to say that, yeah, as far as formats of health plans goes, I did ours a few years ago, and I actually got it all. I've got it all laid out week by week. So in each week, I've got a description of what medicines we might routinely apply if we do, feeding regimes, movement of animals around the croft, and that's a useful format for me, because that's how you think of things. We're in this time of the year. What do we do now? And I have a look through that every year before the assessor arrives and say, well, has anything changed? And what I haven't done recently is go through it with the vet. I did go through it with the vets, and we drew it up with the vets when the land management options was relevant. And so there was an option for that. So you actually got paid to sit down with your vet and do it. So that was good, and that worked well. But I now need to take that forward, and that's my personal experience. So anyone else, any questions or observations? And there's a question in the chat there from Isabella. You want to take that on, Eilidh?
I see that, yeah. So Isabella's asking, she's not a member of QMS, and she's asking what the benefits of membership are. So essentially, Isabella, the benefits of membership are largely in opening up markets, because some consumers, retailers, some buyers will only buy assured stock because of their own policies or because of the destination of the product. They will only buy assured stock. So the simple answer is that it opens up the maximum markets. Now, people often ask about whether that means they get more money. Now, certainly for cattle, that has generally very much been the case, and that is less clear cut for sheep, I would say. Although I have also had complaints this year from store buyers complaining to me that there weren't enough assured sheep for them to buy, so they were going to sales and coming home empty-handed. So you can't win, really. So that there is a market out there. It's just sometimes not a clear-cut thing. Again, just going back to my point about how there was a little bit of gold plating from the UK government this year that meant that non-assured members couldn't export. The assured members were protected against that risk because they were already part of a scheme, and we were happy to say that they do have that veterinary contact that allows them to be exported. In your particular situation with a small number of sheep, if you're largely using the meat yourself or selling it locally, again, that's what I always say to people. It's a decision that people have to make you know, for themselves, and there will be a tipping point at which an enterprise is small and the destination of the produce is such that there is nothing particularly to be gained from membership. But what I would suggest you did is perhaps have a look through the standards. It looks like a massive big document, but actually there's a lot of explanation of each point in there, and the actual points themselves are fairly straightforward. So have a look at the standards and see how close you are. For an awful lot of people, they're actually meeting the standards anyway. They're not a massive leap beyond what you're doing in terms of basic legislation and husbandry anyway. And you can have a look at what your membership would cost, the application forms on the website as well, and make a decision based on that. But as I say, I'm not here to try and sell the standards, sell the scheme to anyone in particular. You know, people will feel it's useful to them, and some people will feel it's less useful, and that's absolutely fine.
Yeah. So just add to that, but even if you think it's not worth your while being a member, the standards are generally very good, and as Eilidh says, you should be following most of them anyway. So you can always have a look at the website, have a look at the standards, see what you need to do for good stockmanship, and then decide whether you need to join or not. And that could be an economic decision. As I say, for us, we sell maybe 150, 140, 150 lambs a year, and it costs us effectively £1 a lamb to be a member. Okay, Alistair.
I think you're on mute, Alistair.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Right. I'm on Benbecula in the Outer Hebrides, and I'll just say, well, I am a member, QMS member. I have been for a long time, before the days of QMS, Squabla. And I suppose largely because I, fully agree with the principle of quality assurance, and to have a quality mark if you are producing anything. But the actual benefits, the previous question about benefits here, in terms of buyers, the marts don't, as a rule, pay much attention. And one of the marts, when you're booking in lambs, they ask you for your holding number and your QMS number. The other mart don't bother. So basically, people are buying just basically a hodgepodge of whatever. I don't think really that in terms of membership, I would say that the cattle members far outweigh the sheep members actually here. And maybe for that reason, because they don't see, any benefit whatsoever, really. And I've tried to interest QMS in actually running some events out here. When I read about them in the press, that they're running events on various things. Even on the food production side, I was involved in something that was kind of looking at butchery training and things like that, adding value, but basically really got nowhere. So anyway, I'm not going to dwell on that. It's a choice, I think, for the person, the crofter himself, to decide why they should be a member or not. I'd like to persevere with it. On this animal health side of things, it's another, well, it didn't really go into cost. There's two things here I'll just sort of mention, see, if you can give me an opinion or an answer. You didn't really say much of anything about cost of the actual health plan. And if the vet is coming to do, I don't get many visits from the vet. I might call him up once or twice for lambing, a difficult lambing. So if it's here and we're chatting away about the health plan while he's spending about 20 minutes trying to get a lamb out of a sheep, then that's fine. But is he going to charge me for that 20 minutes chatting about my health plan, or am I just going to pay the bill for my lambing? I've actually been unable to get an answer from my local vet. Since this was first talked about a couple of years ago, I've been asking about what will be the cost of the actual health plan. And even this morning, in the knowledge that this meeting was coming up, I tried again to get an answer, and I haven't got an answer as to how much it might cost. So that's one little question or comment. The other one, just from what you were saying there about the way it works and the reasons for it, again, I fully support that. But I can't help thinking about, drawing comparisons with other areas of, the food chain or the food sector, where processors, caterers, basically people who are selling or whatever they're doing with the food, and have to produce a food safety management system. Now, a food safety management system, by and large, is risk assessed. So somebody that's in a high risk food business, let's say they're dealing in a ready to eat product, smoking salmon or whatever it may be, or approved premises, cutting plants and things like that, compared to somebody who's in a very low key kind of food business, maybe just a bed and breakfast, for example. And when you risk assess these, the actual plans, if you want to call them that, or the food safety management system, the whole inspection regime is actually risk assessed, and that will determine, the number of inspections that you are required to have by the environmental health officer. Now, there's no correlation here. When you look at a farm that's maybe got, or a croft, that's got, let's say, 200 sheep, and they're bringing in all sorts of stuff. They're bringing in gimmers, they're bringing in tups, they're all over the place. It could be enzootic abortion, it could be sheep scab, you name it. Compare that to, well, my own situation, for example, a completely closed flock where I produce all my own stock and, okay, sell out. But other than buying a tup every couple of years, from that side of things, I would consider myself to be low risk from that point of view, compared to the guy who's got the couple of hundred sheep and whatever. I mean, even by numbers, he's got more sheep than I have, but I see things like bringing in stock, for example, as being what I would call higher risk than what I'm doing. So that's just a comment. And leading to that, if you were dealing with it in a kind of risk assessment point of view, that somebody like me might just need vets, to review my health plan once every 2 years, rather than the other guy who might actually want to review what he's doing more than once a year. He's bringing stuff in and mixing all sorts of things up. So that's it. I mean, this doesn't seem to tie in with other, as I say, other risk assessed parts of the food chain or food production. Okay, I'll stop talking at that.
Thank you, Alistair. Yeah, I'll pass it over to Eilidh. There's a couple of points there, really. One was about costs of vets and the increased costs by having to get the vets involved. And the other one was about, if I paraphrase, is proportionality. So big units should be more rigorously assessed than small crofts. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think some great, well-considered points there, Alistair. Thank you for bringing them up. On the cost of the health plan, my facetious answer is, if your vet doesn't know what they're going to charge you, it's difficult for me to answer what they're going to charge you. But I think it is a difficult one. This question comes up every time we have a meeting like this, and it's not an unreasonable question. But the challenge I have is that vets are all private businesses, and we can't fix a price for what they have to do. They all make their own judgment, and they all charge accordingly. And I've seen such a range of different ways of doing this. So some practices are really interested in health plans. They delve deeply into them and really engage their clients with them. Their clients are right on board with them. They'll spend a lot of time on them, and they might well charge accordingly. Others are really not that interested, and they'll have a quick flick through, cover the basics, sign it off, and won't charge very much at all. Some practices charge per species. So if you just have sheep, you might spend, you know, it might cost you £80 or it might cost you 160 if you've got sheep and cattle. You know, there's all different, there's a huge different range, different spectrum of cost associated out there. So it is difficult for me, because I would love to be able to say to you, it's going to cost you this much, and then everybody can go away knowing exactly where they stand. But I'm just not in a position to do that. So all I can really do is encourage you to go back to your practice and put the thumb screws on them, because it is something that they will be being asked for by other clients as well. So sorry, I'm not really giving you a good answer to that, but I'm just not in a position to do that. I think your point about risks is a fantastic one, and I think you know, I can't really dispute that. I mean, we've had cases of people who were members, you know, they live on an island, they see the vet maybe every 3 years, they're barely off the island, they're the only livestock on the island. The biosecurity risks are absolutely minimal. And I agree with you, it seems bonkers that they should be, you know, they should have to jump through the hoops of you know, literally ferrying a vet over for the purposes of having set foot on the island when there's nothing else on there. So these are the scenarios that we're dealing with here that are really, really tricky to navigate. And I think your point about risk and proportionality is an interesting one. The way assurance schemes have dealt with this is that they view the fact that the vet is there involved in looking at your biosecurity policy and agreeing it with you. The risk assessment is taking place at that level for everyone. So rather than the challenge we have is, in your example of the person with the 200 sheep, do we just do this on a size basis? Do you just say, right, if you've got over 150 sheep, you have to meet different criteria? But it becomes difficult, because you can have somebody with 800 sheep who operate, they're clean as a whistle, they run a really, I mean, I can think of members we have that are pretty big enterprises, but they run very, very, very tight ships. And I would be extremely confident that they operate in a way which is very low risk. So the challenge is where we draw the lines, how we determine what is a bigger risk and what is a lower risk. And by the same token, I mean, there are sometimes some very small enterprises where, and I'm sure we can all think of them, where perhaps some of the behaviours aren't really very well thought through and do put themselves and neighbours at risk, and we have diseases being introduced to co-grazing animals and things. So I think it's a really good point, and if I ruled the world and if I wrote the rules, I like to think that I would try and develop something in that area so it did feel more proportionate. But I hope you can understand that it's not ultimately the reason we haven't done that yet is because there are a lot of grey areas that are challenging, and essentially you would upset somebody whatever you did. But I think it's a very good point, and I think it's something that we will hopefully go on to consider further, perhaps based on some of the feedback we get from the study that Kim at Glasgow University is doing just now. It might inform what we do next. But yeah, thank you for your good points. And actually, one thing I did want to respond to is, I'm really sorry to hear that you haven't got anywhere with doing something out there. And again, on the food side of things, the butchery side of things, you know, the member of our QMS team who deals with butchery, Gordon Newlands, I don't know if you've managed to be in touch with him, but I'd be delighted to put you in touch with Gordon. He's extremely enthusiastic, very, very motivated chap. And if you would like to do something out there, I am nearly certain that Gordon will be keen to try and get something sorted out for you. So if you'd like to get in touch with me, and I can hook you up with him, I'd be very happy to help on that one. Okay,
thanks, Eilidh. Can I just make one comment there to Eilidh? Yeah, the numbers, you said the guy that was, you know, running a tight ship with his 800 sheep. I mean, numbers, I mean, I'm comparing this again to a food safety management system. I mean, numbers comes into it, but, you know, it's low down because of basically the number of consumers that you deal with. You know, if it's somebody that's got a small B&B, again, compared to a big restaurant. But what could be, I mean, you're talking about here about incentives. What incentive is there for a person to be a member of QMS and have a health plan? So going back to my kind of risk assessment question, that the guy with the 800 sheep and runs a tight ship, then he could, let's say in this example, be considered low risk. And let's say that the inspection program or the health program might be, that he needs once every 2 years. But the guy that's only got 80 sheep and is not making a good job of it needs a health plan every year. And what you'd say to that person is, if his animal welfare and animal health issues were a bit dodgy, what you would say to him, if you do X, Y, and Z, you will reach that, you'll be put onto the once every 2 years. And what it would do in theory, I mean, what would attract him to do that might be, well, okay, his sheep were going to be better looked after, but it was going to cost him less if he only needed an inspection every 2 years. So there will be that incentive element, because that's largely how food safety and food hygiene inspections work. That basically, if you're doing a good job and doing the things that the EHO tells you to do, you'll go on to a less stringent or less frequent inspection routine, because you're doing things right. It's all risk assessed.
Yeah.
Anyway,
no, I think it's a great point. No, I think it's a fair point, and I think if something is adapted in future, I think it's likely to be along those lines. Absolutely, yeah. I think I don't have a definite answer for what things will look like in the future, but I think it's a very fair point that you raise.
Thanks very much. That's good. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
Just
Thanks, Chair.
To that I'm not sure whether I should be repeating this or not, but we've had an assessor in the past who said, oh yes, you as an assessor, which holdings you have to spend time on.
Mm-hmm.
So for some holdings, they would book a sort of 3/4 of an hour slot, and other ones they would have a 2-hour slot, because they know they had to check more.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not an annual, biannual inspection, but it's the amount of time that the assessor would spend on it. Anyway, that I'm possibly talking out of turn there, but practically that will be the way it would work. Okay, finished with Eilidh yet? Not seeing any hands up, and I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So, are you hanging around, Eilidh, or your email address?
If you'll have me, yes, I'm going to be educated about where we are at the moment. So no, I'd be delighted to see if you'll have me. Right,
but Eilidh, I'm sure our email address is there. Any other questions that occur to you later?
Well, I just sorry, Russell. Will I just stop sharing and then you can get everybody on the screen?
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Right, now what we'd like to do is I'm just going to introduce Miranda, who, as I said at the beginning, is the SCF policy officer, and she's been labouring for days on end to fill in our response to the agricultural bill consultation. So if you want to give us the highlights of that, Miranda, and then again we'll open up just here, comments on that, what I'd like to say, and maybe at that stage, Donald, who's with us, who's the chair of the Scottish Crofting Federation, we want to say something as well. But certainly from my point of view, I think the work that Miranda's been doing on this consultation and other consultations is really vital for crofting. The value of the Scottish Crofting Federation, that we're actually putting in the crofting viewpoint, and to get it heard by the Scottish Government. Miranda.
Yes, thanks, Russell, and I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I'm gonna give a very brief update on agricultural policy. When we were running these events with QMS in some of the islands and in the north, at least north for me, we would take the opportunity to see our members and just give a bit of an update on the policy work, which at that stage was at a different stage. But it's great to have you all here, and it gives us an opportunity just to brief you on what's going on, but also to say that if there's any questions on sort of the policy side and the work that we're doing there, or anything that we're putting out on social media, newsletters, if you have any questions, by all means get in touch with me. I will pop my email address in the chat at the end. So on the agricultural bill, so as most of you are probably aware, at the end of end of August, Scottish Government launched a public consultation on its proposals for a new agricultural bill. And I started in this job in July, so it was a bit hit the ground running to try to engage with what is perhaps the most substantial sort of communication that we're have seen from the Scottish Government on the future agricultural policy. SCF has put in quite significant resources to formulate a response to this, consulting with our membership directly. So we had an online event, and we also co-organized an in-person workshop in Lerg in November with Nourish Scotland. And we had countless meetings with our internal agriculture and environment working group, which Russell can testify to, as he's the chair of this group, just to formulate a response to what really was quite a difficult consultation with quite a difficult format. And this was partly to do with the fact that this consultation is concerned with the framework for future agricultural support payments. So it was basically asking the public the question on what should come in the place of what used to be the EU Common Agricultural Policy. And it's important to keep that bit in mind, because it was really about a framework legislation and the powers that are necessary to implement a new framework in absence of what used to be in place from the EU. But problematically, I guess, was the fact that the consultation itself consisted of a whole lot of yes and no questions, almost exclusively yes and no questions on whether there was agreement to Scottish Government being granted those powers. And although to some degree this is a necessary evil, we need a framework in place to sort of fill the legal gap that has been left by the Brexit vote. At the same time, 6.5 years since that vote, I think a lot of people were expecting at least some indication on the details on how these powers would be implemented in the future, on how specific schemes would be designed, and ultimately also on how what sort of the total funds would be and how those funds would be distributed within the system. So for those who are not fully aware of the in and outs of that, what Scottish Government was proposing or has been proposing is a move away from what used to be known as the two-pillar structure. So on direct payments, direct agricultural payments on the one hand side, and then rural development on the other hand, that would go, and it would be replaced by a 4-tiered structure, with tier 1 and 2 still being your direct payments, but tier 1 would be payments that would have minimum requirements attached to them. Many of those are probably not that dissimilar of what we already know, for example, under previous greening rules. But there are some changes, or at least there have been proposals for some changes. One of the significant ones being that even the most basic payments would have potentially a whole farm plan requirement attached to it. SCF opposed this for the main reason that the proposals by Scottish government were quite out of touch with what most people would think a whole farm plan is about, a more integrated approach to the farming business. Instead, the document seems to have quite a heavy focus on things like succession and fair work requirements, equality statements, which are very laudable. But it wasn't quite clear why those were like sort of the minimum requirements, and then also how that would be translating to the crofting context. So we've raised some concerns about that. At the same time, we also put a lot of focus in the response that we put forward on distribution of payments, a question that actually was not asked in this consultation, which has been subject of discussion in other fora. But distribution of payments is obviously key. Ultimately, it's one thing to have payments and requirements attached to that, but it does matter how much money, who will receive, whether it's actually worth your while to be trying to comply with new requirements. And we have in particularly argued for redistribution, meaning that the smaller producers, or at least the first hectares, would get a higher payment, sort of front loading, it's also called. And interestingly enough, this is also a point that has been pushed by the NFUS in their response to this consultation. So there is some potential there to take that argument further. And then the other tier, so there's a tier 2, and that is still a direct payment, but with enhanced conditionality, so more stringent requirements attached to it around nature and climate, but we don't know what those requirements will be yet. And then tiers 3 and 4, not always clear what the difference are between those two, but those are the suggested elective and complementary support. So elective support for more localized projects, partly for things like nature restoration, but potentially also for more local supply chain support, etc. And your complementary support for all the services basically around agricultural production, your advisory services, payments for carbon audits, potentially biodiversity audits in the future, etc. Now, in all those tiers, at the moment, what is quite key for crofting and what is really unclear is perhaps also for you, where do other schemes fit in? So those are your crofting schemes, which are actually not really mentioned, CAGs and the housing grant. We probably think that they would continue. We probably think that it would continue under tier 4, but actually we don't know. So this is something that we have expressed that there needs to be clarity on. And then there are the voluntary coupled schemes, as well as the alphas / areas of natural constraints. Again, in the consultation document, seems to be sort of put in tier 4. We're not entirely sure why. When prompted Scottish government to give clarification on that, they couldn't really give an answer to that either. So again, in our response, we have focused on clarity around that, knowing how these schemes fit into the structure that has been proposed. Now, at the moment, government plan is still to have this whole framework in place and working by 2026, which sounds maybe far away, but actually is really quite ambitious. If you compare this to other nations in the EU, but actually also here in the UK, which are actually much further along in developing new systems, but whose timeline is actually less ambitious, you can see that we're a wee bit out of sync with where we perhaps should be at this stage in designing the overall framework, but then also actually designing the implementing measures under that. So this is, I think, a very legitimate concern, one that not only we have raised, but actually it's been raised by almost all parties that are involved in this. And I'm talking about from NFU to the environmental sector, all sort of asking the question, okay, yes, we need to agree on this framework, but what comes next? Because we want to have that clarity on the one hand side to actually deliver on some of the environmental targets. We've got quite strict targets here in Scotland, stricter than in the rest of Europe when it comes to climate. And those targets are fast approaching. So we need to start making a move on to get there. And at the same time, obviously, crofters and farmers will be looking for clarity for their businesses. Where do I make my investments? Do I make that investment now, or do I wait until I know what the rule is going to be or the scheme is going to be? Those are all questions that you'll probably have as well. So we have already shared our views with many relevant authorities. We've shared our response with many authorities, from government officials to parliamentarians to other organizations, and we had quite a good response to this. And whilst in the next ones we are waiting the actual bill, we are looking to continue to do that type of engagement, and also to potentially further develop some of our own positions with regard to really specific topics, such as areas of natural constraints schemes, but also might be in relation to other things like redistribution of payments, like voluntary coupled schemes, to make sure that we also have clear internally what we are asking for, and so that we can take concrete proposals to all the right places. So this was on the sort of agricultural bill side. The consultation is now closed last week. So we are now also engaging in some other processes that are running. There's been lots of things running recently: biodiversity reform, land reform, and at the moment we are working on quite a short but still important consultation around wildlife management. So this one is concerned with muirburn, as well as proposals for putting restrictions on wildlife trapping. And I think here I haven't drafted the full response yet, but I think from the conversations we've had, and also we put a shout out in the newsletter for any of our members to come forward with their vision, with their ideas on this, is that in many ways putting in place more safeguards to ensure operators' competence, whether that concerns trapping or whether it concerns the use of fire in land management, that is to a large degree makes sense. But we need to really make sure that all those new requirements are designed with crofting in mind. I think we legitimately have concerns about this. It's I think sort of a consistent theme around the consultations that we're seeing right now, where at the moment changes across the policy landscape are made on quite big scales. So in terms of agricultural policy, we've seen quite big reforms being made, and in other cases we are seeing, for example, with regards to muirburn licensing, we're seeing that the focus is on the larger scale, so the larger sporting estates, and it's for us to really make sure, and for me to really make sure that those processes don't forget about crofting. And it's actually quite difficult at the moment because there is a lot of these processes running in parallel. But we're doing our very best, and I think the wildlife consultation is one of those examples where we need to be really on the ball. We already know that some of these consultation processes have happened without necessarily us always being there around the table, and we are now involved in all those conversations, and just making sure that the requirements, the new legal requirements that will come out of this will be appropriate and proportionate to crofting activities. And then lastly, in terms of policy, I was going to mention the fact that in the new year there's another rather small consultation, but still important consultation, and that's about a new legal regime on small holdings. And in that instance, quite a different discussion, but we are actually primarily looking to bring in a perspective from sort of the crofting side. So the consultation is often making sort of comparisons with, if we design a legal regimes for small holdings that applies across Scotland, how does this already work in other places? And they're often referenced to crofting and crofting law in relation to rules around diversification, in relation to rules around the right to buy. And I guess it's up to SDF to sort of bring in the lessons that we know, that things that work well and things that don't work well. But yeah, that's for after Christmas. So I will leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Miranda. As I say, it's really important that crofting's voice is heard in all these consultations. Otherwise, it's an afterthought, and what is designed and what is implemented doesn't fit crofting and just makes life more difficult for us. So that's yeah, that's the Scottish Crofting Federation's role in all this. So any questions? Which I don't see any hands up, but Donald, do you want to add to that? Donald, as our chair, is a member of ARIOB, which I forget what it actually stands for, but Donald will tell us. But again, it's SCF having its say at having a presence at the top table. Donald?
Thanks, Russell. So ARIOB stands for the Agricultural Reform Implementation Oversight Board, very snappily titled committee that I sit on. As Russell said, representing crofting's interests as the new agricultural policy is developed. Just to reiterate what Russell said there about how good our response was to the bill consultation, and that was down to Miranda pulling all that information together. A huge amount of work went into gathering that information from some of these public meetings that we've been talking about already, the going around the Highlands and Islands with QMS earlier this summer, through some Zoom meetings that we had, and just drawing on the information that SCF has been gathering for years on how agricultural policy has worked in the past, what hasn't worked, and what we want to see in the future. I don't want to say too much more. Miranda's covered most of it, but just add a wee bit more on what we think about the process so far, and we have been quite critical of the way this is being taken forward, particularly the lack of information that's coming through and the lack of clarity that crofters are getting on what the future might hold. Our businesses aren't short term; they're very long term. We plan in generations, not in year to year. And it's very difficult for us to plan for the future when we don't know what payments are going to look like in the future. And that's exactly what we need to know. We need to know, what are we going to get, how much are we going to get, and what do we need to get it. Just one final thing that's sort of become clearer in the last few months, following a statement from the Cabinet Secretary in Parliament on timelines, is that we've been talking for some time now about conditionality being added to the payment system and having to meet certain conditions to receive payments. It was kind of assumed that there would be a change to how payments were calculated that would go alongside that. But what we've heard recently is that we will see conditionality added, but for the time being, that will be attached to the current payment system, so the 3-region payment system and how that is calculated, and that changes to that won't come in until 2027 at the earliest. So the concern we have there is that crofters are going to be asked to do disproportionately more through the enhanced conditionality to access what in some cases will be an already very small payment. And we think that there needs to be a change in the payment system at the same time as this new conditionality is brought in. You can't separate the two things. So that's just something that's emerging, and that's what's happening in this discussion on the policy, is that we're finding out new information all the time, because as Miranda explained there, the consultation document and the information that's in front of us just now is very much a framework bill. It doesn't have detail, and that's all to follow. I'll stop talking there, but very happy to answer any questions that anybody might have, and I'm sure Miranda will too.
Okay, thanks, Donald. Just puts it all in context. Still don't see any hands up, so if there's nothing in the chat room, just pausing. Screen hasn't frozen, so if there isn't anything else, or if there's widen it out, I mean, not just in these consultations, but if there's things that you as members of SCF think we should be tackling, now would be a good opportunity to raise it. If we're all quite happy with where we are, I will just thank Donald for his contributions, for Miranda there, and for Eilidh for her talk, and just animal health plans, whole farm plans, all these things are coming down the line. So I guess we should be ready for them. So if there's nothing else, thank you all for coming. I hope it's been useful. Oh, Thomas, as I see a hand going up now. Thomas, do you want to come in with something? No, he's just waiting. Right, okay. Thank you all very much. We'll call it a day there, 8:30. We're on time. Great. Right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.